again, we have this overlap this week between what the Torah readings are talking about and some of the main themes and duties of the heart is talking about. What I mean by that is that, well, obviously this, began last week. We're continuing this week. Is a discussion of the plagues in Egypt, and it's so funny because, well, it's just that the way the Torah describes it, you really have to use your imagination for it to really sink in how terrifying that it was. I mean, or at least how awe-inspiring. I mean, sometimes it's just like a verse. There was this happened, and then Pharaoh asked it to stop, and it stopped, and it's just like one sentence, and it's. But sometimes you may need to make your own movie, and in your head, and to really get an idea of what it is that's going on. But beyond that, what these I think there's underlying these readings is about faith, is about belief, is about God sending this message about who He is, and what His powers are, so to speak. I mean, so in other words, through the plagues and through the whole interaction, through this entire series of events, God is teaching something. Something is coming out into the world, is teaching mankind something, and I think in this, it's really right in front of our faces because it's from the first verses in this week's Torah reading, Parshat Bo, which means come to Pharaoh. So it says, Hashem said to Moses, "Come to Pharaoh, for I have made his heart and the heart of his servants stubborn." So why? So that I can put these signs of mine in his midst, so that you may relate in the ears of your son and your son's sons that I made a mockery of Egypt and my signs that I placed among them, that you may know that I am Hashem, that I am God. So first of all, what stands out for one thing is the manipulation of Pharaoh. That one thing and this is really the more complex part, really, right? There's two points here. There's that the people and the future generations should know about the signs and wonders that I did in Egypt. So that's just learning from the actual events, learning from the plagues. And then there's the other aspect of learning from Pharaoh's responses. And in other words, learning, well, it's kind of like learning from how God manipulated and what's the expression? The checkmated Pharaoh, time and time again. Or finally, after it's all over, you get to realize that this whole thing was a manipulation. So, in other words, and that's in a certain sense the more complicated part of this faith and belief that we're learning from Pharaoh, because so we're learning God is the creator. We're learning that God, has dominion over all the areas of nature, which we'll get to in detail in a moment. But then we're also learning that even human beings that have free choice, God is still in control of that too, or at least to the extent that he manipulates wicked people. He can manipulate and control their decision makings, because at the end of the day, what we learned from Pharaoh is that he ended up, through his rebellion, he actually did what God wanted him to do in the first place. And that's what, looking back at it, is the lesson that, the children of Israel would tell their children. And this is what God tells Moses. I made a mockery of Pharaoh. I basically manipulated. Look at this ridiculous. I mean, he goes from, in other words, what is the real reason that Pharaoh refuses to give in? To whose advantage is it that he refuses to give in? It's through the fact that he refuses to give in that all these different signs and wonders and plagues come about afflicting him. If he would have given in, I mean, I understand he maybe didn't give in the first time, but once, twice, three times, I mean, enough already. I mean, how, but he just keeps going. He keeps going. And that is, again, that's actually one of the most philosophically and theologically difficult points. And Maimonides mentions this, and other thinkers talk about it. Like, on the one hand, so is there determinism or is there free choice? Is everything predestined, or are people free to choose? And as Maimonides asked the question, if God knows what you're going to choose, then how is that free choice? If he knows, then it's not free, because that means he already knows what you're going to do. And if you can only do that because it's preordained. I mean, if you can make one of two or more choices, then how could not God know in advance what you're going to do? Of course, I argue that if God is beyond time, it's not that he knows now what you're going to do. He knows because you do it, and because he's in all places at once. So it's kind of a different. If you follow that line of reasoning, the question isn't quite as strong. But but from a more simple approach, how can God know now what you're going to do, since that's in your hand? And there's a whole multiplicity of possible outcomes that you may decide to, you may be your choice. All right. So my point is that when we finish with these 10 plagues and we realize that this is what God wanted, so that comes out very fascinating, that even the free choice of the wicked, even the free choice of those who were rebelling against God, he's in control of that, or at least manipulating that as well. And that's fascinating. In other words, people's rebellion is also part of God's plan. And that's hard to swallow and hard to grasp, yet that's one of the messages here of the plagues, which is even the dark moments in life where wicked people seem to be mocking God, even that he's behind that. There's a plan there. It's not really up to them. And what they're doing in the end of the day is God is only going to laugh at them at the end. And we'll see how everything that they did was all part of God's plan. And in any way, there's a famous story about the destruction of the temple, in which a Babylonian general, I think it was a Radan, if I'm not mistaken, anyway, I don't recall the name, because I think actually he did. In the end, he did attack Jerusalem and slaughter many, many people. But so I don't recall the name, and I don't want to get bore you with this preceding introduction too much. But the point is simply that there was a certain general that came to Jerusalem to besiege it, to destroy it. I think he may have been a Roman general. But the point is, he shot arrows in various directions to see, if this was an opportune time, to attack Jerusalem. Okay? In other words, in those days, people believed in different signs and omens, right? So the point was, is this a good time to attack Jerusalem? If I shoot an arrow up, we'll head towards Jerusalem, which will be a sign that this is the opportune time to attack them. So he shot arrows in every direction, and they all turned towards Jerusalem. So in any event, he asked a passing yeshiva student, a young child, to say his verse, and in any event, the verse reflected the idea that the enemies of Israel act also as God's servants, and then in the end, God punishes them. So the general said, wait a minute, what are you saying? So I'm going to be God's servant and then I'll be punished for doing it? No, I don't want this. And he left. So, but the idea behind it is simply that, yeah, even the Nebuchadnezzar, as the prophet says, is called God's servant. Obviously, he's not doing it because God told him to do it like a prophet. He's doing it on his own accord, but yet he's being manipulated into it. All the different factors are happening around him, and then his own ego, and it's all kind of got part of God's chess game, evidently. And he ends up doing what God wants him to do to begin with. Okay. One more point about this. So there's this question about Pharaoh, right? All right, hold on a second. Anyone have any questions about this before I move on? Any questions at this point? Yeah, okay. All right. You guys know this already? It says this like, okay. All right, I'll move on to the next one. Another issue that you probably may have heard in other classes too, and that is having to do with this idea of hardening Pharaoh's heart. How do we understand the hardening of Pharaoh's heart? If there's this principle of free choice, and then why is God hardening his heart? Isn't that wrong? And how can he then be punished? If it's not his choice. Well, I mean, first of all, it seems like at least the first 5 plagues was totally Pharaoh's choice. And then after that, the verses reflect the fact that God is hardening his heart. I think you even see that even later, even as late as Hail, when Pharaoh calls Moses back and asks him, okay, who's going? And then he's kicked out of Pharaoh's court. So you see, he still doesn't want to let them go, even at that point. And that's already 7 plagues in. So there's 2 different interpretations about that. One is Maimonides' interpretation, which is that God hardening Pharaoh's heart is a punishment for his failure to repent and his insistence up until that point. It has to do with because he sinned so repeatedly that taking away his free choice is a punishment that he received. And also ensures that he gets punished. Because he couldn't, if he would do some type of repentance, he may get out of a lot of the punishment, right? Because repentance may undo that. But the opportunity is taken away from him. The second approach is that in reality, it's not that God took away Pharaoh's choice. He actually gave him the choice. And that means that the plagues had such a psychological, emotional, physical, traumatic effect that a normal person would just be broken and they'd have to give in. Even if deep down they wish they didn't, but they're just human and they just couldn't take it anymore. So Pharaoh was given the ability to withstand, to have the courage and the fortitude to do what he wanted to do, which was to say no, up until finally the final plague of the firstborn, in which he actually did give in. So, but again, this is all reflecting the fact that God's providence is mixing into people's decision making and their ability to persevere. And this is also something, I guess you could say, that is part of the message and the eternal lesson of the plagues of Egypt. And that even a wicked person, his decision making is being manipulated, is being assisted, God's involved in the decisions that he's making too. And maybe even assisting him in doing evil, because that's also part of the heavenly order, that if someone wants to do something, God's assists them in doing so, right? So that's another point. Any ideas or questions so far about this?
That's always been a tough idea for me to deal with too, to take away Pharaoh's free will and hardening his heart.
Yeah, I think we even in our own experiences, I think sometimes we have a sense of certain decisions being easier for us or being led in a certain direction, or certain things being more difficult for us. So God's involved, and there are also certain spiritual. There's a certain spiritual rules and laws, and as we mentioned before, when a person does a certain sin, he'll probably be led towards, and his the strength of his holy soul, his godly soul, is weakened in the body, and he's led towards more sinning and so on. In other words, there's certain rules that in which God put into the world that have the affect our ability to make choices. Also, I think that's another point. I mean, I think we should realize that the verse doesn't say that God coerced Pharaoh in making a choice, but it says that he hardened his heart, right? Hardening, meaning to say or another word, he strengthened it. He made it firm, but it wasn't someone else's heart. It was Pharaoh's decision. God just helped it along. I mean, that's the second approach, right? The second approach is Pharaoh really wanted to do it, but he otherwise, because of extraneous factors, wouldn't have been able to have the strength to do it. So God gave him the extra nudge, gave him the ability to withstand. But of course, looking at it, since we know that the positive and the good is always stronger and more powerful, and God obviously leans towards assisting the good. So if this is true for sinning, for transgressing and rebelling, how much more so for doing good? Because God assists those who are trying to be determined and want to be determined to doing the good and follow his commandments, and he's going to help them and assist them to do so. It was always my understanding that the story of Tamar there is that, Yehuda was overcome with passion, which God put into him. I mean, God does that with human beings just in general, puts that into the species, that people should want to reproduce. And that itself is a compulsion that God put into all of the world. That there's different species, and including human beings that have such individual thought, should feel a compulsion to do what it is that God's deepest desire is, and that is that there should be more human beings on the world. So, okay. So I'm actually starting here from the more difficult, mysterious point, although it's just so important. But it's like Sandy said. I mean, no matter how much I talk about it, I don't know if it really solves it. Meaning to say, not that it's not an answer. Maybe intellectually you can accept, but can we accept it in terms of in reality? In other words, in life, can we accept it? Meaning to say, when we see the existence of evil in the world, is it easier by explaining that, yeah, even God is there manipulating things? We hope so. We hope it brings people some consolation when dealing with such difficulties, whatever they may be. I mean, for example, the October 7th massacre, to say that God is involved in that is, a very difficult thing to swallow. Of course, it's true. Meaning to say, even though there was free choice, but at the same time, no one could succeed if God doesn't want them to succeed, for one thing. I mean, that's a simple part of it. And again, the other part of it is who planted the ideas in the mind of the enemy to do such a thing and how to do it, and who obviously everything is coming from God at the end of the day. So he's present there. So the consolation within that is that deep within this, there must be something good. One approach is that at the end, something good will come out of it. A deeper approach is that there's something hidden from God's perspective that's good right now that we can't understand. It's from our perspective, it's horrible.
So, Rabbi, do you think today, in say, for example, if there's something Hashem wants to accomplish through any one of us, would he still today take away our free will so he could accomplish that thing? And how do I know if my free will has been taken away?
I think that's just something you know, or maybe even I could say even more so. Maybe it's even more reality when you don't know. In other words, the things we do, we don't even think we have a choice. Maybe we really do, but we're just doing them. In other words, what about the things you never thought of doing differently in your life? It never even occurred to you that maybe it should be done differently. Isn't that a little bit that, to a certain extent, it has to do with us, and then to a certain extent, that has to do with God. Meaning to say, at the end of the day, Judaism tells us we have to be responsible for ourselves and our choices. But at the same time, we haven't questioned that for some reason. There's a certain act that we're doing, we never thought, hey, I could do that better or do that differently. Why? Well, we may not have had the merit for that thought to come to our minds to change it. We also may not have maybe put in enough effort of thinking about our lives in a certain way. And I don't mean this to you personally, Sandy. I'm just bringing out theoretically, hypothetically, how this could be possible. Generally, this isn't the case. This is something particularly that happened here with Pharaoh, and the Torah is telling us that this is obviously everything that's happened here is wondrous, that happened in Egypt, something very unique, which is why the people on there would tell their children would remember it as something, wow, that's just amazing. So I don't know if we have to say this is something that just occurs and occurs, but at the same time, for example, there are certain things that are within the bounds of our intellect, within the bounds of our ability, and there are things that aren't. Each of us may or may not know ourselves whether, trying to think of an example. Look, some people are just not smart enough to think deeply enough about a certain thing. Okay. For example, there may be some people that are able to relate to Judaism in a more mechanical way or in a more physical, meaning in terms of conduct, I should do this and this and this. But when it comes to, deeper, more thoughtful, or, study or meditation, they're not meditative. It's not their ability. Isn't that from God? How much intellect a person has and the kind of personality they have, and isn't that really a limitation that God has imposed on us? So, I think we all have, to a certain extent, these type of things. And that's why you have to distinguish between Pharaoh and those situations. In other words, by saying that, again, the second approach is just so much easier. He wanted to do it, but it's very similar to what I'm saying. But outside circumstances, normally within who he was and within his abilities as a human being, he couldn't have really lasted that long. It's not normal. He was given extraordinary perseverance. And I guess my argument is that we could be given that in certain difficulties too, for the good, that we may go through certain difficulties, and God could give us extra amount of divine assistance to make it through. And we often actually do see that. The people are able to get through really difficulties that maybe otherwise I think, no, nobody, in other words, you find, for example, sometimes psychologists, doctors say, oh, people don't live through that. They live a couple of weeks and, you only have so much to live. Yet people sometimes live beyond that. Why? Well, because, God gave them the ability, the fortitude, their body, the extra strength to beat the odds. So anyway, so there's similarities in our lives, but at the same time, there's not, it's not exactly the same. I think what happened with Pharaoh is a lot more miraculous, which is why, it's something to remember for all ages. If it was something that just happens all the time, it wouldn't be so unique. Cheyenne is bringing up a good point. I'm glad she brought that up. Similar to what I was thinking. She brings up about praying to God, that we should remember to do good deeds, I think, if I understood what she's saying correctly. Because, in other words, our forgetfulness, that's God's intervention. Why sometimes we forget, right? Why? Again, you could say if the person worked on it hard enough, maybe they wouldn't forget. But we find it's just very interesting. Sometimes I find myself, or I know of other people, that they just forget. Particularly, there are certain times that you can see God's hand in it. Again, for example, during prayer. There's certain insertions that were supposed to be made in certain days. And and sometimes you start off the prayers thinking you're going to do it. And then just at that moment, your mind gets distracted and you forget, right? And so there's a certain aspect of merit in that person. Maybe that's a certain kind of sort of like a little bit of a punishment or a wake up, that you have to put more effort into your davening, into your prayers, or that it's kind of a message from heaven that hey, pay more attention. I don't want you to kind of like a little bit of a pinch, so that you realize you got to do a better job. But it could be in other mitzvahs too, why a person suddenly forgets to do a certain mitzvah that they usually do. And of course, there's also logical reasons. A person's got their mind distracted with other things, But there are sometimes situations where something's important to someone, quite important, and for whatever reason, suddenly they get busy and suddenly they just forget. And there is certainly aspect of divine providence in that they didn't, if we don't remember. Now, there's something else I wanted to talk about is that, the commentaries discuss, and that is about the plagues themselves. What was the message of the plagues? And because I think it's intertwined with this also. Like at the end, when we see that all these different plagues, and we realize there's this particular message about them all, then that's when you really realize that Pharaoh was manipulated, because you realize they all came for a reason. And if that's true, then Pharaoh had to last until the whole message came out. So in other words, there's two things happening at the same time. The plagues as a whole are teaching us the lesson, and Pharaoh's is lasting and is rebelling until all those lessons come out. You see, so that's really fascinating. So let's take a look at it just from a very, very simple perspective, because I'm the simple guy. So if you look at let's just break down the plagues. Let's take a simple look at them and you'll see something fascinating. Let's look at the first. The first plague is blood, right? That's where so where does that take place? It takes place in the water. It affects the color of the water. The fish in the water die. Second plague, where is that? Also in the water, right? Frogs come out of the water. So it seems like the first thing we're dealing with is God is showing he has dominion over the water in two aspects: the water itself and the living things in the water, right? Those two things. What is the third plague? Third plague is lice. What is that? It's taken from the earth itself. So God has control over the small creatures that creep in the earth. Okay, it's just small animals. What's the next plague? Wild animals. What's that? Large animals that walk the earth, also related to the earth. So there's this idea of like, and don't forget, particularly in the ancient world, there was ideas of the God of the heavens, the earth. Each area had its own guy in charge. So there's a very powerful message here. Oh, that God is control of the water, God is control of the earth, right? And then there's something else that happens, and then we skip. Then we go towards livestock, right? We go to livestock. So we're in animals of the earth with wild animals. That's one domain. But then we get into the human domain of human civilization, human livestock, through disease that they're killed. So God has dominion there also over a person's possessions and the animal world. Then what happens? Then we go on to slaves that affect human beings themselves, right? Which is their bodies, boils, and things like that. And then what happens? And what the next plagues moves on to, so we have everything on the earth, the animals, people in terms of their bodies. Then we go to the heavens, right? The next two plagues are hail mixed with fire, but coming from heaven, right? And then darkness, that's also the sky, right? The air around you goes dark, comes thicker. So that's God controls the heavens above the earth. And then finally, the highest level of all is the taking of the lives of the firstborn, which represents God's dominion over the spirit world. Person's spirits are taken away. So that's the final step. And also that God has the control of the life and death of man. But the final step is taking a person's spirit. That God controls the spirit world, or to the Egyptians, the underworld, the spirits go there. So God is in control of that. So you have these two things coming together, in which Pharaoh assists God in revealing his dominion over everything. And that's we don't understand it. Like, again, every step of the way, put yourselves in the shoes of the children of Israel. Every step, okay, we have a plague, we're saved, and he says no, and it seems from their perspective, it's extremely confusing. First of all, why is God asking permission from Pharaoh? It's almost like God needs Pharaoh's permission. It's a limitation of God's power to ask permission from Pharaoh. It's very strange, right? Why doesn't just God just get rid of him? In fact, Moses tells Pharaoh that, if I wanted to, I could just get rid of you. I could just kill you, just like I killed the livestock. But I'm doing this because I want to show all these signs and wonders through you. So as you're going along, there's all this confusion. And there's all this despair that the children of Israel might be feeling, if you think about it. On the one hand, there's these plagues, but on the other hand, it's like this euphoria and then this low, because they think, oh, finally, look at this, wow, and the Egyptians humiliated, we're finally leaving. No, we're not leaving. It's kind of again and again the same thing, where it's amazing, but yet no progress. And so it gets disheartening, and you could think at a certain point that maybe certain people were losing hope and saying, this guy will never give up, and we're never getting out of here. If all this has happened and he still won't let us out, and God still seems to not have the power, God forbid, that to get us out, then we'll never get in. And finally he lets them out. And only at that point do they realize, looking back, that it all made sense. And similarly, we're going to see that when Mashiach comes. We're going to understand all the different sufferings and all the different, oppression of the nations, different governments and regimes over the Jewish people, over the children of Israel. We're going to understand why this happened, or what this showed, or at least what that brought about in the Messianic age because of such and such. And we'll understand it. Maybe the Mashiach will explain it. And Any questions about this? But the idea is, even so, within the extension of the exile, within the darkness, there's a deep reason for it. And it's often said that although that there's a difference in the exile between this what happened with Pharaoh, and that Pharaoh was in order to bring out God's miraculous power through nature. But at this point, in this exile, is to bring out the great power of the godly spirit in people, of the Jewish people, of righteous people, and that the exile continues, and there's so many difficulties and so much darkness, and yet so much heroism. And according to the Chabad approach, it's the Mashiach will come as a result of the merit of all the hard work that of fulfilling the commandments and doing God's will during the time of the exile. So you could say that that's probably a lot of what we're going to find out, is that all these different challenges were in order that they should build up sufficient, all the merit that will bring to the amazing miracles and consolations that will happen in the time to come. And so after, at that point, when we'll see the relationship between the good, the reward, and the struggle, then we'll realize that, this happened in order to bring us to overcome this challenge so that we could reap this reward. And so from that perspective, it's also manipulating the wicked, because the wicked create the scenario that brings about the situation in which, which Jewish people and righteous people respond to those challenges and therefore merit what we'll eventually see in the end of days. So, and that's when we'll understand, that how their wickedness was used as a way to prop up and to reveal the heroism and strength of the Spirit, which will eventually bring to amazing revelations, rewards, and so on and so forth, which will be, and this is why it's different than in Egypt, it will be by our own effort, and therefore will be eternal. Be by our own effort. Tough pill to swallow a little bit, but that's the thing. At the end, then we'll realize that it was all worth it. It's all worth it. Okay. But you see that connection about the plagues? It's kind of very simple when you think about it. It's a very simple approach, but yet makes a lot of sense. Any other questions or comments? It's interesting, in Tehillim, in chapter 119, and we spoke about this verse last time, but there is a relationship between something that Cheyenne said in verse 18, which is, unveil my eyes that I may behold wonders from your Torah. It's kind of almost like something's being blocked. So something's being blocked from our vision, and God has to unveil us. It's kind of like forgetting, like there's an idea like we just can't get it until God unveils, removes the obstruction, removes the veil, and we're able to comprehend the part of Torah that we were previously unable to. There's this idea that similar to the conversation we were having, is that knowledge of Torah it's a divine gift, and to understand it properly is a gift. It comes through also divine providence. It's not just human ability and human deduction and reason. Those things are helpful, but if a person doesn't merit, they could understand things wrong. A person has to merit to be led in the right way and for the proper understanding to come to them. It's interesting, actually, now that it's come to my mind. It's funny that we're having this conversation now, because in the Chabad calendar, there's a statement today that we read every year on this day, or at least it was this morning. The statement of the fifth Lubavitch Rebbe, Shalom Dov Ber of Lubavitch, it was called the Rebbe Rashav. Shalom Dov Ber Lubavitch. He brings that he says that all the commentaries up to a certain point, says all their writings were all said with the divine spirit, divine inspiration. In other words, all their writings were divinely inspired up until around the 1700s. So you see this idea that Torah study is a direct divine intervention, involvement in a person's knowledge and a person's creativity in Torah, particularly, these great people. But even in us today, there's still godly involvement in whether we understand things and we understand them correctly or not. So a couple of points. Now, if you look at verse 20, it says, my soul is crushed with a longing for your judgments every moment. So this isn't, in fact, this is like even, we spoke about before how King David delights in, in the commandments and studying the Torah. But this is even like another level, like a tremendous longing in which actually, at the moments when he can't occupy himself with Torah, he feels like, crushed. It appears. It's almost like a little bit of a, I don't know, but I mean it in a good way, but it's almost like an addiction. There's such a strong longing. Chapter 119, verse 20. Two. So there's this longing to occupy oneself with Torah laws constantly. That was the level of King David. Wow. It makes a lot of sense according to the Tanya, because the idea is through Torah a person binds with God, and that's where the soul wants to be. The soul wants to cleave to God. So as the soul is woken in the person, and the soul is active, the divine soul is active, so that you feel this tremendous longing to be involved in Torah, which means to be unite with God. And when not in that situation, the soul feels like, an only child that's distanced from its father, far away. Such a person being busy with physical matters is burdensome and difficult. Any questions so far? Comments?